A single sentence, spoken in a desert nearly 4,000 years ago, still pulls fences tight and draws lines on maps. A young Egyptian servant, alone and weeping near a spring on the way to Shur. A messenger from heaven meets her, names her unborn son, and lays down a destiny. A son named Ishmael. A life marked by fierce independence. A family placement described as living face to face, chest to chest, over against his brothers. Not a modern headline. A line from the book of Genesis, chapter 16. The Bible pins a flag in the sand before the word Arab ever appears in the text. The fight between kindred lines begins at a well in the wilderness. The story starts earlier than a border checkpoint. It begins with a promise made to a wandering man from Ur. Abram leaves Mesopotamia around the early 2nd millennium BCE, long before Rome, long before concrete. He follows a voice that tells him to count stars and expect descendants when his tents still feel very small. That voice brings him to Canaan and cuts a covenant with thunder in the night. Animals parted, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch passing between the pieces while Abram sleeps. 400 years of slavery foretold, and then an inheritance spelled out with borders from the river of Egypt to the great Euphrates. This is the land promise that threads through every later headline. It is not vague. The names of 10 peoples are listed. This is the seedbed of the charge that never leaves the soil. Time drags when promises look impossible. Abram's wife Sarai sees her age, the closed door of her womb, and the culture around them uses surrogate service as a normal solution. Hagar, an Egyptian slave in their household, becomes the mother of Abram's first son. Abram is 86 when Ishmael is born. The text underlines the timing. 13 years later, the covenant is repeated and sharpened. Names change. Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. The covenant sign of circumcision is given. A son of promise by Sarah is named before he is conceived, Isaac. The covenant is stated as established with Isaac. The blessing for Ishmael is not withdrawn. 12 princes come from him. A great nation grows from him. 2 boys, separated by calling, both embraced by the same God. On a day of feasting, when the younger boy is weaned, the older boy's presence sparks a reaction. Sarah sees laughing or mockery, depending on the age-old translation debate, and she refuses to see her son share the inheritance with Hagar's son. The patriarch now stands in agony between 2 mothers and 2 boys. The text records God's guidance to Abraham, a hard instruction. The covenant continues through Isaac. Hagar must go, yet God personally pledges to make Ishmael into a nation. So a skin of water and bread are placed on Hagar's shoulder. She steps into the heat of the Negev. When the water ends, God hears the boy's voice, opens Hagar's eyes to a well, and repeats the promise. Ishmael grows up in the wilderness of Paran, becomes an archer, and marries an Egyptian. The details are concrete and sparse. They hit like stones. This family is not a myth. That sentence from the angel in Genesis 16 carries a precise shape. Ishmael's character is likened to a wild donkey, an onager of the desert, untamable, strong, free, made for open spaces. That is not an insult. That is an honor badge in the ancient Near East. Desert nobility. It signals independence and an unwillingness to be fenced by a city-state. Then the placement. He dwells to the east, before the face of all his brothers, not hidden, not dissolved into anonymity. In the biblical world, proximity with unresolved rivalry breeds friction. That line describes a relationship pattern more than a single fight, face to face for millennia. The Bible sets identity and geography like tectonic plates. Abraham's covenant night amplifies the stakes. Genesis 15 reads like a meteor shower of details. Stars impossible to count, a darkness that can be felt, a prophetic timeline stretching from Abram's lifetime to the Exodus centuries later. Then the border description. The river of Egypt on one side and the Euphrates on the other. From the Kenites and Kenizzites to the Jebusites. Ancient geography locked into a promise spoken by God who passes between the pieces alone, making it unilateral. This is not a contract negotiated by two equal parties. This is a sworn oath from heaven while Abram sleeps. The Bible's claim is outrageous and exact. Land and seed wrapped into a bond, not based on human performance. Then comes Genesis 17, and the dividing line within one household becomes unavoidable. Abraham pleads for Ishmael to live under God's favor. The response includes a breathtaking yes and a firm no. Ishmael will become great, a father of 12 princes, a nation numerous and resilient. Isaac, not yet conceived, will carry the covenant name. The tension lands with surgical clarity. Blessing is poured on both sons, but the covenant thread ties to one. This is the seed of inheritance conflicts for thousands of years. Two lines standing on the same family tree, with different legal papers stamped by heaven. Names in the Ishmaelite genealogy pull the camera south and east. Nebaioth and Kedar stand out, later echoed in Isaiah's prophecies. Kedar's tents blackened by the sun. Merchants of Nebaioth, Duma, Tema, and Massa map onto Arabia's deep interior. The Bible uses these names not as footnotes, but as anchors. The chronicler mentions Hagrites in 1 Chronicles 5, a people group descended from Hagar, engaged in border skirmishes east of the Jordan with Reuben, Gad, and half Manasseh. Psalm 83 builds a coalition list that includes Ishmaelites and Hagrites alongside Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, Amalekites, Philistines, and Tyrians. The map looks like a ring of neighbors around Israel. The Bible's conflict web is not invented by modern pundits. It is older than iron. Abraham's life includes a second line of sons through Keturah. Yokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan, names that appear later as Arabian centers. Midian becomes a recurring neighbor and sometimes enemy. In Moses' time and in Judges, the Bible paints Arab identity as a braided rope. Ishmaelites, Midianites, and descendants of Keturah share deserts and caravan routes. Even Esau's descendants, Edomites in Mount Seir, marry into Ishmaelite families. As Genesis records, the Arab world in the Bible is not a single branch, but a grove of related trees growing in similar soil. This complexity matters. It dissolves simplistic slogans and pins the discussion to names and places. The term Arab itself appears explicitly later. 1 Kings 10:15 and 2 Chronicles 9:14 mention the kings of Arabia in the time of Solomon. Nehemiah encounters Geshem the Arab during the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls in the 5th century BCE. Isaiah 21 refers to the desert of Arabia and offers sanctuary commands to the people of Tema for fugitives. Even Song of Songs sighs about the tents of Kedar and the fragrance of frankincense from southern trade. The biblical writers knew these peoples as neighbors, traders, shepherds, raiders, and sometimes allies. The conflict does not erase the shared economies and intersecting lives. It complicates them. The tension most viewers feel on headlines about Jerusalem lives inside this precise map. The Bible traces a claim to the land that passes through Isaac and Jacob, who becomes Israel. The same Bible announces blessing, multiplication, and prominence for Ishmael's line and for other Abrahamic branches. The Bible shows friction at the family level that becomes politics, and politics that becomes prophecy. Hostility does not appear as a one-time eruption. It appears as a condition with a prophetic explanation and a long half-life. Genesis 16 and 17 are not museum pieces. They are accelerators still humming. The biblical storyline refuses to flatten enemies into stereotypes. It holds up Joseph's sail in Genesis 37 with an almost mischievous dual label. The traders are called Ishmaelites in one verse and Midianites in the next, showing either a coalition caravan or overlapping identities. Camels, gum, balm, and myrrh head to Egypt, while a teenager cries from a cistern. That snapshot ties families by blood, commerce and betrayal. It becomes a hinge for Israel's eventual survival in famine and the later Exodus. The Bible keeps reminding readers that rivalries feed destinies in God's hands, without excusing treachery. When Israel exits Egypt in the 13th century BCE, the road north forces confrontations with kin. Edom refuses passage despite shared ancestry through Isaac. Moab and Ammon, descendants of Lot, join the chorus of no. Midian shows up in the story of Balaam and seduction. The Torah's memory collection includes Amalek's ambush, a descendant of Esau, and commands an ongoing memory of that enmity. These accounts install a worldview in Israel's scriptures. Neighbors are kin and competitors, both close and dangerous. The Bible breathes the air of a family neighborhood where shared ancestry does not erase contested wells. The poetic and prophetic books put theological skin on those conflicts. Psalm 120 laments, dwelling among the tents of Kedar, a metaphor for living in drawn bows and sharp words. Isaiah points to Kedar's flocks and Nebaioth's rams, one day ascending God's altar in a vision of future worship, which hints at reconciliation beyond warfare. Jeremiah and Isaiah address Arabia in oracles, not as faceless foreigners, but as parts of the region's living tapestry. The larger story arcs toward a resolution that includes these peoples rather than erasing them. This is the Bible's signature move. Judgment and mercy dance together with hard-edged realism. The jealousy over inheritance becomes explicit in prophetic indictments. Ezekiel 35 addresses Mount Seir, the region of Edom, accusing it of a perpetual enmity and a claim to possess Israel's land as a spoil. Ezekiel 36 quotes the enemy voice saying, "The ancient heights are now theirs." The language sounds eerily current. The Bible's lens insists on two realities at once. Israel's return to the land after dispersion is promised. Neighboring hostilities and rival claims persist. The tension is not accidental. It is predicted and explained. Then the spotlight swings to Jerusalem like a theater cue. Zechariah 12 calls Jerusalem a heavy stone for all peoples, a cup that causes reeling for surrounding nations. The image is blunt. Whoever tries to lift it injures themselves. The Bible insists that this city will become a stage for international stumbling. The detail lands like gravel against glass. This was written in the late 6th or early 5th century BCE, long before embassies and live streams. The text is not playing. It is forecasting. The New Testament does not erase this storyline. It reframes it in a surprising way. Paul, a Jewish rabbi from Tarsus, writes to Galatia in the mid-1st century CE and reaches back to Hagar and Sarah. He uses the two mothers as an allegory for two covenants, one symbolizing slavery and the other promise. He locates Sarah's children as those born by the Spirit's promise and Hagar's children as those bound under Sinai in his argument about law and freedom. He is not redrawing ethnic maps. He is recoding spiritual categories, announcing that Gentiles can be grafted into the promise by faith in the Messiah. He knows this could be misused. He still writes it. The Bible exposes a deeper layer running under geopolitics, a layer of spiritual slavery and freedom. The book of Ephesians anchors that claim with a brick of reconciliation. Christ's death creates one new humanity out of two groups, destroying the dividing wall of hostility and making peace through the cross. The text draws a temple of living stones, where ethnic enemies become part of one house. It is not a political treaty. It is a spiritual creation that spills into how enemies eat and pray together. The book of Acts gives a concrete scene. At Pentecost, about 30 CE, diaspora Jews and proselytes from all over the Mediterranean and beyond hear a small group of Galileans speak in their languages. The list includes Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamians, Judeans, Cappadocians, Romans, and Arabs. Luke names Arabs. The sound of wind, fire on heads, and words about the mighty works of God ringing in the ears of Arab listeners in Jerusalem. before Islam exists. The seed of reconciliation lands in the same city that Zechariah called a heavy stone. This is the Bible's pattern. It names the conflict. It refuses to sanitize it. Then it releases a different power into the same space. The solution is not a paper agreement or a stronger wall. The solution is a heart transplant that creates a single household. This sounds mystical until one remembers history's stubbornness. The human heart shapes borders. More than borders shape hearts. The Torah teaches a legal ethic that includes love for the stranger, the jar, and equal justice in the gates. These commands do not require a utopia. They require obedience. The prophets cry when these commands are ignored. The beat of the story never stops. Centuries after Abraham, new conflicts arise with familiar faces. During King Jehoshaphat's reign in the 9th century BCE, Arabians bring tribute, recorded in 2 Chronicles 17. Thousands of rams and goats. The very next chapters contain raids by Philistines and Arabians against Judah. The alliances and enmities shift, but the neighbors remain the same families. By the time of Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE, when Jerusalem's walls are rebuilt under a Persian imperial umbrella, Geshem the Arab stands alongside Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite in resistance. Names and networks remain consistent. These are not cartoon villains. These are regional power brokers, acting like humans act, with pride, fear, and envy. The wisdom literature points inward. Proverbs puts the spotlight on envy and strife. James, the New Testament wisdom echo, states that conflicts come from passions at war within us. Genesis 4 taught the same lesson with Cain and Abel. The Bible does not excuse violence. The Bible diagnoses it as a heart disease. That diagnosis matters when looking at a street where a synagogue and a mosque stand within the same block. The old family tree is visible in the skyline, and the same human condition beats beneath both roofs. The prophetic arc that includes Ishmael's line points past conflict toward worship. Isaiah 60 stuns with a picture of nations streaming to Zion, bringing wealth and herds. The flocks of Kedar and the rams of Nebaioth ascend the altar and are accepted. Names straight from Ishmael's genealogy walk into a future temple scene. This is not grudging coexistence. This is participation in joy. Isaiah 19 draws an even wilder horizon, a highway stretching from Egypt to Assyria, passing through Israel as a blessing in the midst. Egypt, called God's people. Assyria, called the work of his hands. Israel, called his inheritance. Enemies in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE receive affectionate titles. The prophet paints a day when they lift their hands together. The Bible's vision pushes past the edges of realistic diplomacy and refuses to back down. The book of Jonah already gave a foretaste. A Hebrew prophet detours to a Phoenician ship and then to a fish before stepping into Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. He preaches, and the city repents, from king to cattle. God relents from judgment. Jonah resents this mercy, and the book ends on a question in the text, not in this narration, that exposes Jonah's heart. The story clobbers tribal pride. If Assyria can repent, so can an enemy close to home. The Bible uses far enemies to shame near grudges into humility. It is surgical brilliance. Then there is the detail that often goes untold. Abraham dies, and Genesis 25 records that Isaac and Ishmael bury him together at the cave of Machpelah. No dialogue is invented in the text. A simple note, 2 sons at the same tomb, a family picture of a father, honored by his divided boys. For a day, an overture of peace stands quietly in a field purchased long ago from Ephron the Hittite. That shared act threads hope through the rivalry. The Bible knows the cost of funerals. It also knows the way. Funerals gather enemies under one roof and remind them of blood. The same family reunion pattern appears with Jacob and Esau. Years of fear build on Jacob's side after stealing blessing and birthright. Esau rides out with 400 men. Jacob splits his camp, sends gifts and bows. Esau runs and embraces his brother. Tears fall. Later generations will fight like the prophecy predicted, but the moment of mercy returns for a heartbeat. The Bible preserves that moment like a pressed flower. It smells like reconciliation and then fades, but it proves something. Enmity is not absolute. Choices exist. The biblical claim about why the Jewish-Arab conflict persists rests on three pillars that reinforce each other like an iron triangle: identity, inheritance, the human heart. Identity goes back to Abraham and runs through Isaac and Ishmael, with genealogical markers that the text refuses to dilute. Inheritance sits in the land promise and the covenant decision that runs through Isaac, while blessing still pours on Ishmael. The human heart carries envy, pride, fear, and vengeance across generations, unless confronted and transformed. These are not abstractions. They are the scaffolding behind every broken window in a contested neighborhood. History outside the Bible's pages fills in the timeline that the Bible predicted. In 586 BCE, Babylon tears down Jerusalem's temple and drags many Judeans into exile. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel speak during that crisis, promising a return and a new covenant. In 538 BCE, under Cyrus of Persia, exiles begin returning, just as Isaiah had named Cyrus by name almost 2 centuries earlier. The Second Temple period runs until Rome crushes Jerusalem in 70 CE. After the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132-135 CE, Judeans are banned from the city. The Bible had already said dispersal and return would mark Israel's long story. Deuteronomy 28:30 lays both blessing and curse in relentless detail. The Jewish presence continues in the land and in diaspora across centuries. By the 7th century CE, Arab tribes unified under the banner of Islam sweep through the region. In 638 CE, Caliph Umar receives the surrender of Jerusalem. In 691 CE, the Dome of the Rock rises on the Temple Mount, a gleaming dome marking the rock tied to Abraham's near sacrifice. The Quran does not name the son, but Islamic tradition often identifies him as Ishmael, especially in Mecca's rites for Hajj. The Bible identifies the son on Mount Moriah as Isaac in Genesis 22. The stage is set. Two narratives rooted in Abraham stand over the same stone. The Bible's claim and the later Islamic memory overlap and diverge above a city the Bible called a heavy stone. The Jewish-Arab conflict inherits this sacred geography, and the Bible already predicted that Jerusalem would feel like a cup of staggering. Yet the Bible's most audacious claim still stands. This conflict does not have to end with annihilation or endless Cold War. Isaiah 2 and Micah 4 announce swords beaten into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, nations streaming to Zion for instruction. No more war school. The Messiah, the Prince of Peace, judges between nations and arbitrates disputes. The desert blooms. The flocks of Kedar find a home at God's altar in a house of prayer for all peoples. Echoing Isaiah 56, where foreigners who join themselves to the Lord are welcomed, their sacrifices accepted, and their names written on the walls of a house with doors thrown open. The Bible never abandons Ishmael. It calls him into a future feast. The narrative of Ishmael's nature deserves a second glance. The wild donkey image signals a love for freedom carved into the bones. The desert's children do not saddle easily. That trait becomes survival in harsh environments. Tents of goat hair, coffee brewed strong, stories sung in long lines under star-sown skies. The Bible nods to that culture in passing lines and place names. Kedar's tents, Tama's hospitality, Nebaioth's herds. The scene smells like cardamom and leather. Arab generosity and warrior pride fit the biblical sketch of Ishmael's descendants like a well-worn cloak. This is not romanticization. It is textual realism. When the writers of the Bible speak to the heart of conflict, they slam into the same wall modern negotiators slam into, then point to a different doorway. The problem is not only borders. The problem is the human will bound to self. Genesis 3 sets a time bomb with a promise of enmity between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed. That primordial enmity infects brother to brother in Genesis 4. It oozes through Abraham's household, appears at Sinai in the golden calf, and sits on the throne of David in episodes like Uriah's murder. The Bible reads human nature like a doctor reads CT scans. Without the heart changed, treaties are paper over a fault line. The story tightens around what the Bible calls peace, not the kind that depends on at least 5 signatures and 100 battalions, the kind that breaks hostility in the chest. Bless those who curse you replaces vengeance with a barbecue. Loan fields to a hated neighbor during drought. Leave gleanings in the corners of the field for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. These commands sit in Leviticus and Deuteronomy like unexploded ordinances of grace. Israel's prophets blast corruption when the powerful crush the weak. The law forbids wronging the heir, the resident alien, and commands love for him, because Israel knew the taste of exile in Egypt. That ethic functions inside covenant identity and land inheritance. It does not cancel the covenant. It instructs the covenant people to wield it with justice. The New Testament pushes deeper. In Ephesians 2, the wall of hostility falls inside a house, where Jews and Gentiles worship together as one new man in Christ. That is not a theory. In Acts, Jewish believers in Jerusalem sell property to feed a growing, diverse community. Gentiles receive the Holy Spirit in Caesarea without circumcision, after Peter's vision, in Acts 10, and a council in Acts 15 ratifies the inclusion. A Pharisee named Saul, who once dragged believers to prison, becomes Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, and calls Arab listeners brothers and sisters in letters that travel the Roman roads. The early church includes Arab Christians in regions like Nabatea, and later in cities like Damascus and Homs. The Bible's answer to ethnic enmity takes shape on the ground as a counterculture. The Bible also does not pretend that this counterculture instantly erases centuries of conflict. Paul rebukes Peter for separating from Gentiles under pressure in Antioch. Barnabas disagrees with Paul over John Mark. The early church navigates ethnic distribution fights in Acts 6 when Hellenistic widows feel neglected. The gospel does not create perfect humans. It creates a community that keeps forgiving. That is a different kind of power. In a neighborhood where one family writes 1,948 in black marker, and another writes 1,967 on the wall. The persistence of the Jewish-Arab conflict in biblical perspective remains brutally honest. It persists because promises and identities remain alive. It persists because hearts harden when old wounds are scratched. It persists because prophetic words about Jerusalem have not completed their course. Many modern analyses add imperialism, economics, and trauma. The Bible factors those in through the doctrine of sin and the doctrine of providence. God's sovereignty architected a plan that calls Israel back to its land after dispersion, calls Arab peoples into blessing and worship, and calls enemies into unity in the Messiah. Every headline sits inside that blueprint. The Jewish return to the land after centuries of dispersion sits under prophecies like Ezekiel 36:37. Dry bones come together, sinews and flesh laid over them. Breath entering, a metaphor for national resurrection. The promise includes both physical return and spiritual renewal, with a new heart and a new spirit. The nations around see this and react. Ezekiel records a taunt in 36, nations saying the ancient heights are ours. Zechariah 12:14 depicts sieges and deliverances, mourning and cleansing. Isaiah 11 speaks of regathering exiles from the four corners of the earth. The Bible's story of return drags neighbor reactions into the script. No wonder the conflict persists. The script said it would until a final intervention. The same prophets articulate the dignity of the nations around. Isaiah 19 crowns Egypt and Assyria with blessed titles. Obadiah condemns Edom for gloating and violence against Judah, while still situating Edom in the family tree. Amos judges Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, and Ammon, alongside Judah and Israel. God acts as judge of all nations impartially. The law includes precedents for resident aliens receiving justice. The Psalms envision all the families of the earth blessing the God of Israel. The Bible's energy does not allow demonization. It burns for justice and for mercy at the same heat. The modern map includes Arab Christians and Messianic Jews who live this counterculture in the same towns. Shared worship in Hebrew and Arabic. Simple acts like bringing diapers to a mother whose husband is detained, stopping a rumor before it burns another street. The Bible does not award political victory as the supreme good. It awards faithfulness to the God who calls peacemakers his children. That kingdom strategy can look weak until one tracks its survival across centuries of persecution and propaganda. The Bible plays a long game with granite patience. Then comes the glimmer not often highlighted in conflict talk. The first-century church included Arabs at Pentecost, as Luke states in Acts 2. That means the gospel reached into Arab tribes before Islam's rise by more than 5 centuries. The old family branches already held leaves from the tree of life in their hands. Church history later records Arab Christian centers in Petra, Bostra, and Hauran, Nabatean kings, and Edomite converts, Herod the Great among them, signal the messy overlap of identities. The Bible's story anticipated a mosaic, not a monolith. That mosaic never disappears, even in heated times. The apocalyptic passages many cite for escalation end with a stunning downshift. Gog of Magog storms the land in Ezekiel 38:39 with a coalition, and God humiliates the invader. The prophetic camera cuts from war scenes to cleansing and rebuilding, to a temple vision in chapters 40-48, to a river flowing from the sanctuary that heals the Dead Sea and waters trees with leaves for healing. War ends with water and fruit in that text. Isaiah 2 and Micah 4 set the prophetic tone that nations will learn war no more under the Messiah's reign. Zechariah 8 puts old men and women in the streets of Jerusalem, children playing safely. That peaceful image carries more power than 100 tanks, because it is the stated goal of history in Scripture. Micah's and Isaiah's swords into plowshares line is engraved at the UN across the street from where modern diplomats wheel and deal. The Bible's explanation for the conflict's persistence never removes human agency. Nations still sin. Leaders still choose ego over humility. People still see or forgive. The Bible puts the final solution in the hands of a king who judges with righteousness and gentleness. In the meantime, it commands the people of the covenant to practice justice and love mercy in real neighborhoods. Prayers rise from Jews and Arabs daily, in the same languages their forefathers uttered in markets and tents. The Bible says God hears Hagar in the wilderness, God hears Isaac on Mount Moriah, and God hears exiles by the rivers of Babylon. The Scriptures do not paint God as a tribal deity with only one ear. The same God orders Israel to treat the stranger like a native among them, and to remember their own slavery in Egypt. The same God rebukes Edom for violence born of brotherhood, betray. The same God promises that he will be found by nations who did not seek him. The cumulative weight of these texts turns the conflict into a family argument heard in heaven. The persistence of the Jewish-Arab conflict in biblical terms finally makes sense when those 3 pillars line up. Identity is not erased, it is redeemed. Inheritance is not denied. It is stewarded under divine ownership. The human heart is not managed. It is made new. The Bible underlines each. God renames Jacob as Israel and never undoes it. God names Ishmael and never retracts the blessing. God anchors land grants within his own authority and disciplines Israel when it profanes justice. God invites all nations to his mountain and welcomes their gifts. The persistence comes from a tension that exists by design until the appointed reconciliation arrives. The cynic reads those lines and sees fantasy. The Bible records enough blood to answer that charge. It does not whitewash history. It places blood under Passover doors, under a cross in Jerusalem, and then under self-sacrifice for enemies. This is the only path the Bible endorses that actually breaks cycles. Bless those who curse. Pray for those who persecute. Keep truth in your mouth and generosity in your hands. Advocate justice in courts. Refuse lies. Expect God to vindicate, rather than building altars to revenge. These commands address households and cities and ministries. They stand when politics trembles. The ancient promise still vibrates. Abraham hears, leaves, waits, receives, and becomes a father of multitudes. Sarah laughs at childbearing in old age and names her boy Laughter, Isaac. Hagar weeps and hears and finds water, raising her son into a desert force. Ishmael fathers 12 princes: Kedar, Nebaioth, Dumah, Massa, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, Kedemah, Adbeel, Mishma, Mibsam, Hadad, names made of dunes and wind. Isaac passes blessing to Jacob. Jacob to the 12 tribes. Prophets write. Kings fall, temples rise and disappear. Psalms echo under arches and over dunes. Every line insists that God sees both sons and all their children. This is the Bible's answer, unvarnished and electric. The conflict persists because the family story is not finished. The Bible refuses to hand the ending to cynicism. It hands it to a vision with flocks of Kedar on the altar and a highway tying together empires once at war. It anticipates a day when Isaac and Ishmael's descendants stand shoulder to shoulder, not only at a graveside, but at a feast. It offers a map where Jerusalem is hard to lift, but destined to shine. It appeals to hearts now, not after elections. It seeks people who will live like the future is already invading the present. 2 brothers stand face to face in Genesis. 2 peoples stand face to face in news feeds. The Bible installed that geometry in the creation of their stories. It also painted a new geometry where enemies become neighbors and neighbors become kin. That future will not be forced by guns or clever speeches. It will arrive because God keeps promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Ishmael, to Israel, and to the nations. Every real act of forgiveness today flickers with the light of that day. Every meal where bread crosses a cultural line reaches into that future. Every prayer that refuses to curse blows oxygen on it. The single sentence by a spring in the wilderness keeps making sense of headlines and graves. A son by a slave girl grows into a free man of the desert, living face to face with his brothers. The story could have ended there with endless hostility. The Bible stitches a different ending on top. A heavy stone city becomes a beacon. The tents of Kedar are welcome. The 12 princes of Ishmael find their place. The 12 tribes of Israel find their king. The highway from Egypt to Assyria passes through fields where children play. In that frame, the conflict is not the last word. The last word belongs to the God who hears and who sees, who calls sons by name, who writes a book that never forgets the family buried in Hebron and never stops calling them to the same table.